January 17, 1945, Luzon, the Philippines. The monsoon rains had turned the jungle floor into a slick palette of mud and rotting vegetation. Somewhere in the dense green labyrinth west of Manila, a Japanese lieutenant named Takeshi Yamada crouched. Behind a shattered mahogany tree, his uniform stiff with dried sweat and blood that was not entirely his own, his Type 14 Nambu pistol felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hand. For 3 days, he had watched his company dissolve like morning mist knot in the glorious charges they had rehearsed at the Nakano school. But in isolated pockets of confusion, cut down by artillery they never saw, picked apart by an enemy, that moved with mechanical precision. Now, with his ammunition spent and his men scattered like leaves before a typhoon, Amada heard the distinct crack of American voices threading through the undergrowth. His fingers found the small cyanide capsule sewn into the lining of his collar. He had carried it since Guadalcanal, a final insurance against the dishonor that imperial military doctrine insisted was worse than death itself. The voices grew. Closer, English words he could not parse. The lieutenant closed his eyes and prepared for the darkness he had been taught to embrace. What happened in the next 60 seconds would fracture everything he believed about warfare, honor, and what it meant to be human. To understand the profound psychological rupture that Japanese officers experienced when confronting American treatment of prisoners, one must first grasp the ideological chasm that separated these two civilizations at war. The Imperial Japanese military of the 1940s operated within a philosophical framework so fundamentally alien to Western military tradition that it rendered mutual comprehension almost impossible. This was not merely a difference of tactics or strategy. It was a complete inversion of values regarding life, death, surrender, and human dignity. The Senjinkan, the Imperial Army's field service code issued in January 1941, explicitly stated, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a bad name." This was not metaphor or rhetorical flourish. It was doctrinal. Instruction encoded into the very identity of every soldier from the moment he was conscripted. Japanese military training emphasized that surrender represented not just military defeat but spiritual annihilation, a stain that extended backward to dishonor one's ancestors and forward to curse one's descendants. The captured soldier became a ghost, even while breathing, a non-person excised from family registers, expunged from official memory. To be taken alive by the enemy was to experience a fate literally worse than death, a living contamination that violated the sacred bond between emperor, soldier, and the eternal spirit of Yamato. This ideology manifested in the treatment Japanese forces inflicted upon those they captured. In the aftermath of battles across the Pacific Theater, American medics and intelligence officers documented patterns of systematic brutality that defied Western military comprehension. Prisoners were not merely killed, they were subjected to torture, medical experimentation, beheading, and public humiliation before execution. The Bataan Death March of April 1942 forced approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners to walk 65 miles in tropical heat without adequate water, food, or medical care. Those who collapsed were bayoneted or shot. Those who attempted to help their comrades were beaten. An estimated 10,000 men died during the march, and in the hellish conditions of Camp O'Donnell that followed. This was not the result of logistical failure or individual sadism, though both existed, but rather the logical extension of a military culture that viewed surrender as moral forfeiture. If Japanese soldiers who surrendered deserved death for their cowardice, then enemy soldiers who surrendered deserved nothing better. The POW camps administered by the Imperial Japanese Army throughout Asia became laboratories of dehumanization, places where the captured existed in a liminal state between life and death, their suffering justified by a philosophy that denied them fundamental human status. Yet as the war progressed and the industrial tide turned inexorably against Japan, something unprecedented began to occur. Japanese soldiers, conditioned from childhood to choose death over capture, began to survive, sometimes through injury that rendered suicide impossible. sometimes through the simple chaos of combat that left them unconscious or trapped behind rapidly advancing American lines. Sometimes in those final desperate months of 1944 and 1945, through the gradual erosion of certainty that comes when celestial victory reveals itself as terrestrial defeat. These men awoke in field hospitals or prison stockades expecting the final bullet, the blade, the punishment that their own code demanded. Instead, they encountered something their training had insisted was impossible, an enemy who treated them as human beings worthy of medical care, adequate food, and basic dignity. This cognitive dissonance, this complete rupture between indoctrinated expectation and lived reality, proved more psychologically destabilizing than combat itself. Japanese officers, especially those educated in the rigid hierarchies of military academies, found themselves in a philosophical void. They had been prepared for death. They had been prepared for torture. They'd not been prepared for respect. Lieutenant Yamada regained consciousness in a tent that smelled of antiseptic and canvas. The sounds came to him. First, a portable generator. Humming somewhere nearby, men speaking in calm voices, the metallic clink of surgical instruments. Pain radiated from his left shoulder, where shrapnel from an American mortar round had torn through muscle and bone during his final attempt to retreat. He opened his eyes to fluorescent lighting powered by American engineering. Technology so far beyond the oil lamps and candles that illuminated Japanese field hospitals that it seemed almost supernatural. A medic impossibly young, with freckles. Across his nose was changing the dressing on his wound. The American noticed Yamada's consciousness and said something in English. The lieutenant did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not mocking. It was not cruel. It was the voice one might use to reassure a frightened animal. Another American appeared, this one older, wearing the insignia of a captain in the medical corps, through a Nisei interpreter a Japanese. American soldier whose very existence violated Yamada's understanding of loyalty and identity. The captain explained that the shrapnel had been removed. That infection had been prevented with something called penicillin, that Yamada would recover fully. The lieutenant tried to form words to ask the question that dominated every corner of his shattered worldview. Why? Why expend precious medical resources on an enemy? Why not simply let him die or accelerate the process with a bullet? Oh, the captain seemed to understand the unspoken question. Through the interpreter, he said simply, "Because you're wounded." That's what we do. This scene, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater from 1942 to 1945, represented something unprecedented. In the Japanese military experience, American forces, operating under the Geneva Conventions and guided by a military culture rooted in Enlightenment concepts of human rights, treated prisoners of war according to established international protocols. They provided medical care, adequate nutrition, shelter, and protection from summary execution, not as generous gestures, but as legal and moral obligations. For Japanese prisoners, this treatment was incomprehensible. Their own military had taught them that Americans were demons, sadistic barbarians who would torture and mutilate prisoners in ways that made death preferable. Instead, they received powdered eggs, canned meat, chocolate bars, and cigarettes. They slept on cots instead of mud. They received mail through the Red Cross. They were addressed by rank and allowed to maintain elements of military dignity. The material abundance alone was staggering. American POW camps consumed more resources on prisoner welfare in a month than many Japanese field units received for combat operations in a year. But it was not the food or medicine that destabilized Japanese officers most profoundly. It was the underlying philosophy that such treatment revealed, an entire cosmology of human value that contradicted everything they had been taught about strength, weakness, and the nature of warfare itself. The ideological implications of this abundance proved even more destabilizing than the material facts. Japanese military philosophy rested on the assumption that sacrifice and hardship forged superior warriors, that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that the soft, comfort-seeking democracies could never match the dedication of soldiers willing to die for the emperor. American treatment of prisoners exploded this assumption. Here was an enemy that combined material abundance with military effectiveness. that treated its own soldiers well and still won battles, that extended basic human dignity even to captured enemies and still advanced inexorably across the Pacific. The philosophical foundations of Bushido, of the entire imperial military ideology, began to crack under the weight of this contradiction. If American forces could be simultaneously strong and humane, effective and generous, then perhaps the brutal calculus that equated suffering with virtue was not universal truth, but cultural construction. Perhaps there were other ways to organize human societies, other relationships between individual and state, other definitions of honor that did not require ritual suicide to preserve abstract concepts of faith. Captain Haruki Ito, company commander, captured during the Battle of Okinawa in May 1945, experienced this ideological rupture with particular intensity. Ito came from a family of military aristocrats. His grandfather had served in the Russo-Japanese War. His father had been wounded in the Siberian intervention, and his own training had emphasized absolute loyalty to the emperor as the supreme organizing principle of existence. He expected execution immediately after capture. Instead, he was processed through a POW facility, where American soldiers filled out paperwork with bureaucratic precision, logged his personal effects with careful attention to detail, and assigned him to a barracks where he slept under blankets and received 3 meals a day. The Americans even offered him the opportunity to write letters home through the International Red Cross, though he could not bring himself to send them. What words could possibly explain his continued existence to family members who believed he had died with honor? In the barracks at night, Ito lay awake trying to reconcile his lived experience with his training. The Americans were not demons. They were not sadists. They were young men who showed each other photographs of sweethearts and families, who complained about the heat and the food with the same weary humor that Japanese soldiers employed, who seemed to view military service not as sacred duty, but as temporary burden to be endured before returning to civilian life. This fundamental difference in military culture, the relationship between soldier and state, became increasingly apparent. 2 Japanese prisoners, as they spent months and years in captivity. American servicemen spoke openly about their desire to return home, about the jobs and educations and families waiting for them after the war. They discussed military strategy and political decisions with a casualness that would have resulted in severe punishment within the Imperial Japanese Army, where questioning orders from superiors was considered tantamount to treason. American soldiers seemed to view the war as a problem to be solved, a job to be completed efficiently so that normal life could resume. They fought hard, but they did not fight for abstract spiritual concepts or to achieve glorious death. They fought to win, to end the conflict, to go home. 2 Japanese officers trained in a system where individual existence had meaning only in relation to the emperor, where personal survival was less important than abstract honor. This pragmatic approach to warfare seemed almost childish in its simplicity. Yet this same simplicity had generated victories across the Pacific, had broken the Japanese defensive perimeter, had brought American bombers within range of the home islands. Perhaps some prisoners began to think there was strength in this democratic individualism that Japanese military philosophy had dismissed as weakness. The symbolic object that came to represent this ideological divide was surprisingly mundane: the cigarette. American forces distributed cigarettes to prisoners with the same casual abundance they distributed everything else. These were not the harsh throat-burning substitutes that Japanese soldiers rolled from whatever tobacco scraps they could scavenge. These were manufactured cigarettes, uniform in size and quality, packaged in colorful boxes, produced in quantities that seemed almost hallucinogenic to men accustomed to rationing. In the POW camps, Japanese prisoners would hold these American cigarettes reverently, studying the packaging with its cheerful graphics and English text, smoking them slowly to make each one last. The cigarette became a tangible symbol of American industrial power, a reminder that this was a nation that could produce luxury goods for its soldiers even while prosecuting a global war on multiple continents. But more than that, the act of American guards offering cigarettes to prisoners casually, without ceremony or condescension, represented a fundamental recognition of shared humanity that Japanese military culture had systematically denied. In that simple gesture, the enemy became human. And if the enemy was human, then what did that make the Imperial Japanese soldier, who had been taught to view all enemies as subhuman obstacles to be destroyed? Lieutenant Commander Kazuo Sakamaki, the only survivor of the 5 midget submarines that attacked Pearl Harbor, spent nearly 4 years in American captivity. Beginning in December 1941, his case was particularly significant because he became the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces, a status that made him both celebrity and object lesson. Sakamaki had attempted suicide multiple times. He had tried to drown himself after his submarine grounded on a reef, had hoped American forces would kill him upon capture, had contemplated various methods of self-destruction during his first weeks of captivity. Instead, he was treated for his injuries, interrogated with methods that seemed absurdly gentle compared to Japanese intelligence techniques, eventually transferred to a prisoner of war camp where he spent the remainder of the war. In his post-war memoir, Sakamaki described the profound shame and confusion of those years, but also the gradual, reluctant recognition that his American captors seemed to operate according to different moral principles than those that governed Japanese military behavior. He watched American guards discipline each other for mistreating prisoners. He observed Red Cross inspections that resulted in improved conditions. He witnessed the massive logistical effort required to maintain POW camps according to international law, an effort that could have been devoted to direct military operations, but was instead allocated to prisoner welfare. The psychological impact of this treatment intensified as the war progressed, and news of American victories filtered into the camps. For Japanese officers, each defeat represented not just military setback, but civilizational failure. They had been promised divine wind, supernatural intervention, celestial victory. Instead, they heard of Midway, of Guadalcanal, of Saipan, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They heard of firebombing campaigns that turned Japanese cities into crematoriums, of atomic weapons that vaporized Hiroshima and Nagasaki in seconds. And through all of this, their American captors continued to treat them with scrupulous adherence to Geneva Convention protocols. The contrast became almost unbearable. Japanese military forces had subjected prisoners to unspeakable horrors justified by philosophical certainty about Japanese cultural superiority. American forces representing a civilization that Japanese propaganda had dismissed as weak and corrupt demonstrated systematic humanity even as they destroyed the Japanese military machine with industrial efficiency. The question that haunted Japanese posts in those final months of the war was not how America had won superior numbers and industrial capacity made that inevitable, but rather what kind of civilization could combine such overwhelming, destructive power with such careful attention to the treatment of captured enemies. Major Nakamura's diary entries from August 1945, after the atomic bombings and Japanese surrender, reveal a man completely unmoored from his philosophical foundations. August 16, 1945. The Emperor has surrendered. The divine nation has fallen. Everything we were taught was lies, or truth so partial it became indistinguishable from lies. I think now about the Chinese prisoners I saw executed in Manchuria, the casual brutality we inflicted because we believed they were inferior, subhuman. I think about the American pilots we handed over to the Kempeitai, knowing they would be tortured. I justified all of it through loyalty to the Emperor, through the certainty that we represented civilization confronting barbarism. Now I sit in this camp where our captors treat us better than our own officers treated Japanese soldiers, where abundance is so common it is wasted, where individual human dignity seems to matter more than abstract concepts of national honor. I do not know what I am anymore. I do not know what Japan is. I know only that we were wrong about nearly everything that mattered. This crisis of identity and philosophy was not unique to Nakamura. Thousands of Japanese prisoners experienced similar psychological ruptures, similar collapses of certainty. Some retreated into denial, insisting that American treatment was elaborate, torture designed to break their spirits. Some embraced their new understanding with the fervor of religious converts, becoming vocal advocates for democracy and human rights in post-war Japan. Most existed somewhere in the middle, carrying the contradiction within themselves for the rest of their lives. The training that insisted surrender meant death. The experience that proved otherwise, the unbridgeable gap between ideology and reality. American forces were not perfect in their treatment of Japanese prisoners. Incidents of abuse occurred. Racial prejudice influenced behavior, particularly in the immediate aftermath of battles where casualties ran high and emotions overwhelmed. Doctrine. But the systematic policy established at the highest levels of American military and political leadership emphasized adherence to international law and basic human rights, even when dealing with an enemy that recognized no such obligations. This policy was not purely humanitarian. It served strategic purposes, encouraging surrender by demonstrating that American captivity was not the nightmare that Japanese propaganda promised. But the strategic calculation rested on moral foundations, on a fundamental belief in human dignity that transcended battlefield identities. The Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans who served in the United States Army despite their own families being interned in camps within American borders, played crucial roles in bridging the cultural and linguistic gap between captors and prisoners. These young men, fluent in both Japanese language and American culture, served as living contradictions to Japanese propaganda about American racial policy. They were ethnically Japanese, but culturally American, loyal to a country that had imprisoned their parents but willing to risk their lives in military service. For Japanese prisoners, the existence of Nisei soldiers raised profound questions about identity, loyalty, and belonging. How could these Japanese-descended men fight for America against Japan? How could they reconcile their ancestral heritage with their national identity? The Nisei interpreters offered a different model of citizenship, one based not on blood and soil, but on shared political values and constitutional rights. They demonstrated that democracy, however imperfectly practiced, allowed for a pluralistic identity that Japanese military nationalism explicitly rejected. In conversations with prisoners, Nisei interpreters explained American concepts of individual rights and limited state power ideas that seemed almost incomprehensible to men raised in a society where individual existence was meaningful only in relation to the emperor and the state captain. Ito spent hours in conversation with a Nisei sergeant named Thomas Tanaka, who had been born in California to immigrant parents and had volunteered for military service shortly after Pearl Harbor. Tanaka spoke Japanese with a slight American accent, a linguistic marker of his hybrid identity that initially made Ito uncomfortable. Over time, however, Ito found himself drawn to Tanaka's patient explanations of American political philosophy. Tanaka described a system where government derived legitimacy from the consent of the governed, where citizens could criticize political leaders without being arrested, where multiple parties competed for power through elections rather than military coups. To Ito, this sounded like chaos, like a civilization constantly on the verge of collapse. Yet this supposed chaos had produced the massive industrial machine that had defeated Japan, had generated the scientific advances that created radar and atomic weapons, had sustained a military effort across two oceans simultaneously. Tanaka explained that freedom was not the opposite of strength, but rather its foundation. That societies which respected individual rights unleashed creative energies that authoritarian systems could never match. The sergeant was careful not to be didactic. He answered questions, offered observations, shared his own experiences of growing up Japanese in America, but he did not proselytize. His very existence, however, served as proof that alternative social organizations were possible, that one did not need to choose between cultural identity and national loyalty, that pluralistic democracies could generate both material abundance and military power. The material conditions of the POW camps themselves served as daily lessons in democratic capitalism's productive capacity. American forces constructed entire cities in remote locations, mess halls, medical facilities, administrative buildings, recreational areas with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost magical to Japanese prisoners accustomed to their own military's chronic supply failures. These were not crude temporary shelters, but proper structures with electricity, plumbing, and heating systems were applicable. The camps had libraries stocked with books, athletic equipment for recreation, even materials for artistic pursuits. Japanese prisoners carved elaborate sculptures from soap bars provided in their hygiene kits, painted watercolors on paper scrounged from administrative offices, organized traditional music performances using improvised instruments. The Americans not only allowed these activities, but encouraged them, viewing productive recreation as preferable to the boredom and tension that might otherwise dominate camp life. For officers like Major Nakamura, this represented another ideological challenge. Japanese military culture viewed hardship and suffering as inherently virtuous, as necessary components of spiritual discipline. American military culture seemed to view unnecessary suffering as inefficient, as something to be minimized through proper logistics and organization. Both armies sought victory, but they pursued it through radically different relationships between institution and individual. The food, especially, became a focal point of Japanese prisoners' attempts to understand their captors. American military rations, whether combat K rations or camp mess hall meals, contained calories and nutritional variety that far exceeded what Japanese frontline troops received. Prisoners gained weight in captivity, sometimes dramatically. Men who had survived on rice balls and occasional fish scraps found themselves eating beef, pork, chicken, eggs, bread, butter, jam, canned vegetables, fresh fruit when available, and desserts with alarming regularity. The portions seemed enormous, almost insulting in their abundance. But it was not just the quantity that stunned Japanese prisoners, it was the casualness with which Americans treated food. The way soldiers complained about mess hall meals even as they consumed in one sitting what might have fed a Japanese squad for days. This casual relationship with abundance extended to everything: clothing, medicine, ammunition, fuel. American military logistics operated with such surplus capacity that waste became routine. Damaged equipment was often abandoned rather than repaired. Partially empty supply containers were discarded. Food that was merely unappetizing rather than spoiled was thrown away. For Japanese prisoners, this profligacy was shocking, almost offensive. It also revealed an economic system with such deep productive capacity that it could afford to be wasteful. It operated with margins of surplus unimaginable in resource-starved Japan. Lieutenant Yamada, recovering from his wound in the POW hospital, watched American medics work with equipment that seemed to belong to a different era of civilization. X-ray machines, blood plasma, surgical kits with specialized instruments for specific procedures, pharmaceutical supplies that included dozens of different medications for various conditions, all of it flown in or shipped across thousands of miles of ocean. All of it available in quantities sufficient to treat both American wounded and enemy prisoners. The contrast with Japanese military medicine was absolute. Japanese field hospitals operated with minimal supplies, often without anesthesia, with surgeons who performed amputations with saws that were not properly sterilized between patients. Japanese wounded died of infections that American penicillin would have cured easily. Japanese soldiers suffering from malaria, dysentery, and beriberi received token treatments at best, often simply being left to die when they became too weak to continue fighting. Yamada had watched comrades die slowly from treatable conditions. Had grown numb to the suffering that was routine in the Imperial Japanese Army. Now he was himself receiving medical care superior to what Japanese officers could access. The irony was almost unbearable. He was alive because the enemy valued even enemy lives more than his own nation had valued its soldiers. This recognition that American forces treated prisoners better than the Imperial Japanese military treated its own soldiers proved psychologically catastrophic for many Japanese officers. It undermined the fundamental narrative that had sustained them through years of hardship and combat. They had endured terrible conditions believing that such suffering proved their spiritual superiority, that material deprivation was the price of moral virtue, that their willingness to die demonstrated cultural supremacy. But if the Americans could fight effectively while eating well, sleeping comfortably, and receiving excellent medical care, then perhaps suffering was not actually necessary for military success. Perhaps the entire philosophical framework that equated hardship with virtue was simply a rationalization for institutional failure, a way of making scarcity seem like choice. Perhaps the Japanese military's brutality toward its own soldiers, the beatings, the starvation, rations, the medical neglect was not cultivating superior warriors, but simply breaking human beings for no strategic purpose. These thoughts, once admitted, were impossible to suppress. They led to cascading doubts about authority, about tradition, about every certainty that had structured Japanese military life. The liberation of Allied prisoners from Japanese camps in late 1945 provided the final, incontrovertible evidence of the ideological chasm between the two military cultures. Japanese prisoners in American custody heard reports of what American and Filipino prisoners had endured: the starvation, the systematic brutality, the casual executions, the medical experiments. They learned of camps where death rates exceeded 50%, where prisoners were literally worked to death on railroad construction projects, where guards competed to devise creative methods of torture. Many Japanese prisoners initially dismissed these reports as propaganda, as the sort of exaggeration that all sides employed during wartime. But as evidence accumulated, survivor testimonies, photographs, documentary film footage, forensic analysis, denial became impossible. The contrast was absolute and damning. American forces had treated Japanese prisoners according to international law. Japanese forces had subjected Allied prisoners to systematic atrocities that violated every principle of civilized warfare. For Japanese officers, particularly those who had served as camp administrators or guards themselves, this recognition carried unbearable moral weight. They had participated in or witnessed atrocities that they had justified through obedience to orders and loyalty to the emperor. Now they confronted the reality that those orders and that loyalty had made them participants in evil. The codes of honor they had followed were compatible with industrial-scale cruelty. Major Nakamura's diary from September 1945 contains entries of profound despair and self-recrimination. He had not directly participated in prisoner abuse. His capture on Saipan occurred before he could be assigned to such duties. But he had been trained in the ideology that justified such treatment, had absorbed the teachings that classified prisoners as non-human. He wrote of conversations with American interrogators who asked him to explain Japanese military philosophy, to help them understand the systematic brutality that characterized Japanese treatment of prisoners. Nakamura tried to explain the concepts of honor and shame that dominated Japanese military culture, tried to describe how surrender was viewed as spiritual death, tried to articulate the logic that made cruelty toward prisoners seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Americans listened politely, asked clarifying questions, took notes, but Nakamura could see in their faces that his explanations did not really translate, that the philosophical framework he was describing seemed to them not like an alternative moral system, but like moral failure dressed in cultural costume. One interrogator finally said, through the Nisei translator, "Major, do you believe human beings have inherent dignity, regardless of their actions or status?" Nakamura did not know how to answer. His training said no human value was contingent on fulfilling obligations to the emperor and the nation. His experience in American captivity said, yes, he had been treated as if he possessed inherent worth despite his status as defeated enemy. The question exposed a gulf wider than the Pacific Ocean, a difference in foundational assumptions about the nature of human existence that made mutual understanding nearly impossible. Yet some form of understanding eventually emerged, not through intellectual argument, but through sustained exposure to American democratic practice. Japanese prisoners spent months and years observing how American military units functioned, how decisions were made, how disputes were resolved, how authority was exercised and limited. They noticed that American soldiers could refuse orders. They believed to be illegal a concept utterly foreign to Japanese military doctrine. They observed that American officers who abused prisoners faced disciplinary action, that the system contained internal mechanisms for accountability and correction. They saw that the same constitutional principles that limited government power domestically also constrained how the American military treated captured enemies. This was not perfect racial prejudice, and individual cruelty still manifested in the camps. But the system aspired to ideals of justice and human rights, and those aspirations had institutional force. For Japanese prisoners socialized in a military culture where power was essentially unlimited once one achieved sufficient rank, where orders from superiors were absolute regardless of moral content, this represented a fundamentally different relationship between individual and institution. The American system suggested that there were values, human rights, legal principles, moral constraints that existed prior to and independent of state authority. This contradicted everything Japanese military philosophy taught about the emperor. As the source of all value and meaning, Captain Ito, in his conversations with Sergeant Tanaka, gradually began to articulate a new understanding of these concepts. He came to see that Japanese military culture's emphasis on self-sacrifice and group harmony had been weaponized, turned into tools of authoritarian control rather than genuine communal solidarity. He recognized that the brutality Japanese forces had inflicted on others and on their own soldiers did not emerge from strength, but from profound insecurity, from the fear that any relaxation of rigid discipline would cause social collapse. He understood that democratic society's embrace of individual rights and pluralism reflected confidence rather than weakness, a belief that human beings could govern themselves without requiring absolute submission to centralized authority. These insights came slowly, painfully, through accumulated experiences that contradicted his training. Tanaka never told Ito what to think. He simply provided information, answered questions, and occasionally challenged inconsistencies in Ito's reasoning. The transformation was Ito's own work, a rebuilding of his philosophical foundations stone by stone. By the time Japan surrendered and Ito prepared for repatriation, he was no longer the man who had been captured on Okinawa. That person, certain of Japanese superiority, convinced of the emperor's divinity, willing to die rather than surrender, had been killed by exposure to an alternative way of organizing human society. What remained was someone new, uncertain, burdened by guilt for past actions, but also open to possibilities that his younger self could never have imagined. The cigarettes that American guards distributed to prisoners carried symbolic weight beyond their material value. Japanese prisoners would hold these manufactured cigarettes carefully, would study the English text on the packaging, even if they could not read it, would smoke them slowly to make them last. The cigarette represented everything they had been, told about America, the industrial power, the material abundance, the casual waste of resources on non-essentials, even during wartime. But it also represented something more subtle, a gesture of one human offering, another a small comfort across the barrier of enmity and language. In that moment of exchange, the American guard extending a pack of Lucky Strikes or Camels, the Japanese prisoner accepting with a slight bow. Something shifted. Not dramatically, not immediately, but cumulatively, incrementally.
Nice.
Those small human interactions accumulated into a different understanding of what the enemy actually was. Not demons, not barbarians, not the racial inferiors that propaganda had promised. It's just young men far from home, fighting a war they wanted to end, still treating captured enemies with the same basic decency they hoped to receive if their own positions were reversed. The cigarette became a symbol of reciprocity and shared humanity, a small acknowledgement that even in the midst of total war, some fundamental recognition of common human status could persist. The return of Japanese prisoners to Japan after the war completed their ideological transformation in unexpected ways. Many found their own country almost unrecognizable, shattered not just materially by American firebombing, but psychologically. By the emperor's surrender announcement and the subsequent Allied occupation, the proud empire they had fought to preserve no longer existed. In its place was a defeated nation occupied by American forces, its political structure being rebuilt according to democratic principles, its citizens struggling with hunger and homelessness and profound uncertainty about what Japan would become. For officers like Major Nakamura and Captain Ito, The return home was not triumphant, but intensely ambiguous. They had survived when they were supposed to die. They had been captured when they were supposed to fight to the last. They had experienced decent treatment from an enemy they had been taught to view as subhuman. These experiences set them apart from Japanese citizens who had endured the war at home, with different traumas and different narratives about what had happened and why. The returned prisoners carried knowledge that was difficult to articulate. That sounded like criticism of Japanese military culture at a time when such criticism seemed like betrayal of the men who had died fighting. Yet over time, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, and then as an independent democracy, the experiences of these former prisoners contributed to broader social transformation. They had seen alternative ways of organizing military forces, of treating individuals, of balancing communal obligations with personal rights. They had witnessed a civilization that combined material prosperity with military effectiveness, that treated its soldiers well and still won wars, that extended basic human dignity even to defeated enemies. These lessons informed post-war Japan's embrace of democratic institutions, its rejection of militarism, its development of a constitution that explicitly renounced war as a tool of national policy. The transformation was not simple or uncontested. Many Japanese citizens resented the imposition of American values, viewed the occupation as humiliation. But for those who had experienced American captivity, who had seen the alternative up close, democracy seemed less like foreign imposition and more like liberation from the suffocating ideological constraints that had made possible such terrible suffering and such catastrophic defeat. Lieutenant Yamada, whose capture in the Philippine jungles opened this story. Returned to Japan in 1946, his family had believed him dead. His name had been removed from official registers, his memorial tablet placed in the family shrine. His reappearance was emotionally complicated, joyful, but also awkward, raising questions that had no easy answers. He did not speak much about his time in American captivity, at least not at first. But over the years, as Japan stabilized and prospered, as democratic institutions took root and flourished, Yamada became more willing to discuss his experiences. He spoke about the moment he prepared to take the cyanide capsule, about his certainty that capture meant torture and execution, about his shock when American medics treated his wounds with the same care they provided to their own soldiers. He spoke about the food, the medicine, the cigarettes. He spoke about the Nisei interpreters who embodied impossible identities. He spoke about Sergeant Tanaka and Captain Ito, and the long conversations about democracy and human rights that seemed abstract at the time but gradually reshaped how he understood his place in the world. In the 1960s, Yamada became a teacher, educating a generation of Japanese students who knew war only from textbooks and elderly relative stories. He tried to convey to them not just the facts of what happened, but the ideological rupture it represented. The way that encountering an enemy who treated you as human could shatter everything you believed about strength and weaknesses, honor and shame. The relationship between individual and state, the broader historical significance of these individual transformations extended far beyond Japan. The American military's treatment of Japanese prisoners during World War II established precedents and generated institutional knowledge that influenced how the United States approached subsequent conflicts. The recognition that humane treatment of prisoners served strategic purposes, encouraging surrender, generating intelligence, demonstrating moral superiority, became embedded in military doctrine. This was not always honored in practice. The Vietnam War, the War on Terror, and other conflicts revealed gaps between principle and practice, moments when fear and anger overwhelmed doctrine. But the principle itself persisted. The idea that even in war there were moral constraints that could not be violated without losing something essential about what the nation claimed to represent. This principle traced its lineage through the Geneva Conventions, through Enlightenment philosophy, through religious traditions that insisted on inherent human dignity. But it was tested and refined in places like the POW camps, where Japanese officers confronted the dissonance between what they expected and what they experienced, between the demons their propaganda had promised and the flawed but fundamentally decent human beings they actually encountered. The symbolic cigarette, offered and accepted across the gap of enmity and language, became something more than just a small material comfort. It became a reminder that even total war did not require total dehumanization, that strategic effectiveness and moral decency were not mutually exclusive, that the strongest civilizations might be those that recognized the humanity even of their enemies. This was not weakness. The same military that distributed cigarettes to prisoners also prosecuted the war with overwhelming force, destroyed Japanese military capabilities systematically, and imposed unconditional surrender. But the strength was tempered by principle, constrained by values that insisted human dignity could not be completely erased even by the most bitter conflict. For Japanese officers who experienced this firsthand, who survived when they expected death and received care when they expected cruelty, the cigarette became a physical token of a larger truth about how democratic societies could wield power. Without becoming what they opposed, it represented the possibility that military effectiveness and human decency could coexist. That victory did not require abandoning the principles one claimed to be defending. In the decades after the war, as Japan and the United States became allies rather than enemies, the survivors of these experiences gradually shared their stories more widely. Major Nakamura's diary was eventually published in Japan in the 1970s, generating considerable discussion about the Imperial Japanese military's ideology and its consequences. Captain Ito wrote a memoir that compared his training at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy with his observations of American military culture during his captivity. Lieutenant Yamada gave interviews to historians researching Japanese prisoners' experiences in American custody. These testimonies contributed to a broader reckoning with wartime ideology, a recognition that the Bushido Code as weaponized by the Imperial Japanese military had led to catastrophic moral and strategic failures. The accounts also complicated American narratives about the war. They revealed that even in the midst of brutal conflict, American forces had often lived up to their stated principles, had treated enemies with basic humanity even when not required to do so, had demonstrated that democratic values could survive the crucible of total war. This was not universal. There were atrocities committed by American forces, moments when principle collapsed under the pressure of violence and fear, but the systematic policy, the institutional commitment to Geneva Convention protocols and CHN, basic human rights, had been real. And it had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate strategic goal of encouraging enemy surrender. The philosophical question at the heart of these experiences remains urgently relevant. How do civilizations at war maintain their moral identity? How do democratic societies wield necessary power without becoming indistinguishable from authoritarian enemies? How do soldiers balance the instrumental violence required by combat with recognition of the common humanity they share, even with enemies? The Japanese officers who confronted these questions in American POW camps did not arrive at easy answers. Many carried profound guilt for their participation in a military system that had inflicted terrible suffering. Many struggled to reconcile their pre-capture ideology with their post-capture experiences. Many spent the rest of their lives working through contradictions that had no simple resolution. But their experiences offered evidence that maintaining moral constraints, even in wartime, was possible. That treating enemies with basic human dignity did not prevent military victory. That democratic principles could survive and even be strengthened by being tested in the most extreme circumstances. The recurring image of the cigarette, extended and accepted, smoked slowly, valued for both its material comfort and its symbolic meaning, serves as a fitting emblem for these complex truths. It was a small thing, trivial in the context of global conflict and historical transformation. Yet it carried weight beyond its physical substance. It represented choices about how power would be exercised, about whether strength required cruelty or could coexist with decency, about what kind of civilization the United States aspired to be, even when locked in existential struggle with an enemy that recognized no such constraints. For the Japanese officers who accepted those cigarettes, who smoked them while contemplating the ruins of their ideological certainty, the gesture became a seed of transformation. It did not erase their guilt for past actions. It did not simplify the moral complexity of their situation. But it opened a space for different thinking, for recognition that alternative ways of organizing human societies were possible, that the rigid hierarchies and brutal discipline of Japanese military culture were not inevitable features of civilized life, but choices that could be questioned and rejected. As the last survivors of these experiences pass into memory, their testimonies remain as evidence of what total war reveals about civilizations and ideologies. The Japanese officers who could not understand why Americans treated enemies with respect eventually came to understand that this seemingly paradoxical combination, overwhelming force tempered by moral constraint, was not weakness, but perhaps the most potent form of strength. It was strength confident enough to be generous, power secure enough to be decent, victory that did not require the complete dehumanization of the defeated, the cigarette shared between guard and prisoner, the medical care extended to wounded enemies, the food that exceeded what Japanese soldiers fed themselves. All of these small material facts accumulated into a larger truth about competing visions, of how human beings should organize themselves, what obligations they owed to each other, what limits should constrain even necessary violence. The Japanese officers who survived to witness these truths carried them back to a defeated nation that would be rebuilt according to democratic principles. Their experiences, initially sources of shame and confusion, became in time contributions to a broader transformation. They had seen the alternative. They had witnessed that civilization and decency and material abundance could coexist with military effectiveness. They had learned, through the most difficult education imaginable, that there were ways of being human that their training had insisted were impossible. The cigarette burned down to ash, the smoke dissipated, but the lesson remained that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, even across the gulf of enmity and incomprehension, recognition of shared humanity could flicker to life and refuse to be completely extinguished.